So this slide gives a nice kind of summary of what we've discussed so far this semester, where we talked about the biosphere and what it includes. And within the biosphere, we have biotic parts that are or were living. And then we talked about what is life, what does it mean to be living. And then we talked about how do we build life. So we talked about atoms coming together to make molecules, and molecules, we talked about their classification and what that means for us in our diet in terms of building the molecules that our body needs to stay healthy. Now we're going to talk about what happens when you put those molecules together and you make that first unit of life. That is, you use these molecules to build organelles and cells. So we're going to talk about that next. All right, so all cells are either found in prokaryotic organisms or in eukaryotic organisms. So all cells are either prokaryotes or eukaryotes in nature. Sorry, I have a cold, so I'm kind of stumbling with my words these days. I'm trying to find my voice. So let's talk about the difference between prokaryotic and eukaryotic. And if you look at this figure here, you might see some differences right away. One thing you might notice is the prokaryotic cell on top here is a lot more simple. It's not nearly as complicated as the eukaryotic cell pictured below it. Another difference is that the prokaryotic cell is a little bit smaller, and actually the size distinction is even greater than this figure shows. So let's compare and contrast these prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells, knowing that every single cell that exists on Earth, as far as we know, falls into one of these two categories. The first thing is size. So as we mentioned before, prokaryotic cells are smaller than eukaryotic cells. And I think this picture shows a better representation. The large cell there in the middle that's yellow in color that has these kind of branching out points, that cell is a eukaryotic cell. It's a white blood cell, so it's one of our cells. Around it, you'll see several prokaryotic cells. These are bacterial cells that are kind of rod-shaped and somewhat blue in color. And you can see the size distinction, and this is pretty typical. Now, of course, because this is biology, there are always exceptions to the rule. So we do know of some prokaryotic cells that are unusually large in size and may even exceed some of our eukaryotic cells. But generally, prokaryotic cells are much smaller than eukaryotic cells. Another difference is the location of DNA. So we're going to learn a little bit more about organelles and what they are in a minute, but in eukaryotic cells, the DNA is contained inside inside organelles. For example, much of the DNA in eukaryotes is contained within the nucleus. We do see some exceptions with some DNA being found in the mitochondria and chloroplasts if the organism has chloroplasts, but the vast majority of the DNA is found in the nucleus in our eukaryotic cells. Compare that to our prokaryotic cells. They don't have a nucleus, and so the DNA is not contained inside a nucleus. It is floating freely inside the cell. There is a region where we find DNA that we identify as the nucleoid, but this is not a separate compartment like the nucleus is. And that brings me to my third point, and that is the presence of organelles. There are structures that are common to both prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells, things like a cell membrane, and ribosomes, and we're going to learn more about those structures later. But there are some structures that are unique only to eukaryotic cells, and that is organelles. So what are organelles? Organelles are these defined, they get their name because they're like organs inside the cell. And those organs are separate spaces because they are made up of these phospholipid membrane bubbles. All right, so let me show you a picture here of a eukaryotic cell. And you can see that there are compartments, very clear compartments, such as the nucleus, which is a membrane bubble, a phospholipid membrane bubble. And then you can be inside the nucleus or you can be outside the nucleus. The mitochondria are another example. They're pictured here, as well as the Golgi and the ER. Those are all membrane bubbles inside the cell that have distinctive functions. And they provide things to these eukaryotic cells. Now, prokaryotic cells do not have those membrane bubbles. They do not have organelles. They have cell parts. You know, you can see the ribosomes, for example. We mentioned those. We can see a flagellum here, but they are not membrane defined. All right, so you've probably seen something like this at some point in the past. This is a system that we use to classify all the diversity of life and to help categorize that life based on similarities and evolutionary history. And if we take all the living things on the planet, we can divide them into 6 what we call kingdoms. And each kingdom contains many examples of species that exist on Earth that are part of that kingdom. And then we can get more and more selective as we go down kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, etc., with species being the most specific and including only one species. I do want to point out, don't learn the order of this right now. If we have time later this semester, we'll get to it. If you have interest, let me know. We can get to it. But for now, I want you to focus on the kingdom level. This is representing one kingdom, the animal kingdom, of which we are a member. But there are other kingdoms. And those other kingdoms are represented on this table. All right, so what I want you to do is look at this figure. I guess it's more of a figure than a table. Look at this figure, and I want you to see the 6 different kingdoms. They've kind of got them branched away into domains. That's even a higher level. We're not going to worry about the domains right now, but there's the bacteria kingdom on the far left. Then you have archaea, plants, fungi, animals, and protists. And I don't care if you learn the Latin or you learn the English versions. Plantae versus plants. Plants is just fine with me. The plant kingdom is fine. If you would, I would highly encourage you to draw this in your notes, because for whatever reason, when I started having students draw this, it helped improve their understanding later on down the road with some activities that we do later in this unit. So take a moment, pause the video, and draw this out. Add the labels for the 6 different kingdoms. Okay, you may notice that we have these 4 kingdoms on the right, that they are sequestered off into the domain Eukarya. You might guess that the reason that they get that name is because those 4 kingdoms are the ones that have the eukaryotic cells. And then the 2 on the left, domain bacteria and domain archaea, or kingdom bacteria and kingdom archaea, those are the ones that are made up of prokaryotic organisms with prokaryotic cells. Let's learn a little bit more about that. So all cells are either prokaryotic or eukaryotic. The prokaryotic cells are found among members in 2 kingdoms. The first kingdom is bacteria. And back when I first learned this in general biology, when I was sitting where you're sitting, I learned that all the prokaryotic cells were in kingdom bacteria, that there was only one kingdom with prokaryotic cells. But we learned that some of these prokaryotic cells are a little bit more distinctive. And so we needed to divide them up, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So here are bacteria. So bacteria come in all sorts of shapes, some diversity in size. So there are round bacteria, rod-shaped bacteria. These are spiral bacteria. All right, so lots of different shapes. They can be autotrophic or heterotrophic. We already defined these terms earlier in the semester, but just to remind ourselves, some bacteria can make their own food, so they can do photosynthesis or other processes to make their own glucose. And by making that glucose, they can then use that to fuel their metabolism. Other organisms, other bacteria are heterotrophic. They have to consume resources from other organisms. So they get their resources maybe from eukaryotic cells, for example. These are single-celled organisms, so bacteria only exist as single-celled organisms. We don't see them. They may make clusters, like we see pictured on the left, that almost look multicellular, but you could take one of those away and it could survive just fine on its own. Interestingly enough, if I ask people what type of cells have cell walls, most people will only say plant cells, but actually bacteria have their own type of cell wall. It's chemically different. It's not cellulose-based like we saw with plants, but it is a cell wall that serves a similar function in giving them structure and protection from the environment. It's also a major target for antibiotics. One thing, I put this slide in here to remind me to tell you that bacteria are not our enemies. All right, many of us think that bacteria are all bad. They certainly are not. Of course, there are some that cause disease, but our bodies absolutely depend on bacteria for their function in order to digest our food properly, to adjust the pH, to keep away some of the pathogenic bacteria. It's really important for us to have bacteria. And there's actually, if you were to count the number of cells in your body, so sitting in your chair right now, if you were to count the number of bacteria cells, they would outnumber the number of human cells because they're so all over our bodies and inside our bodies. So you have more bacteria cells in your body than you do human cells. And actually, if you were to count the number of bacteria cells that are in your mouth right now, that number is bigger than the number of human beings that have ever existed on the planet. So big numbers, right? Lots of bacteria. Like I said, back in the day, we used to think all these prokaryotic cells were bacteria. But we started to realize that some of these cells were very different than bacteria, than others. And so we ended up branching them off into their own kingdom, which we call archaea. They're still prokaryotic, they don't have organelles, they're small in size, but they have some other distinctive characteristics. So they have cell walls, they have those other characteristics we saw with bacteria, but what makes archaea special is they live in these extreme environments where we typically wouldn't find bacteria. So places of extreme heat, for example, or high sulfur content, or really cold climates. They can live in these extreme environments. Another thing that makes them very distinctive is their DNA. So their DNA sequence is actually more like our eukaryotic organisms than it is like bacteria. So even though they're structurally like bacteria, they're genetically different. They are also, some of them are also autotrophic. Some of them can rely on resources in the environment, maybe not even the sun. They can use other resources in the environment to make their own food. And then some individuals are heterotrophic, still relying on other life for their existence. And like I said, these things are genetically more like eukaryotic cells than our bacteria are. And so that was kind of an interesting find, and that's what caused us to branch them into two different kingdoms. Okay, so eukaryotic cells are found in the four remaining kingdoms. So the four species in the four remaining kingdoms all have eukaryotic cells, but there are still distinctions that make them different. Plants, for example. Plants are multicelled organisms, right? They have multiple cells as pictured here. This is a sample of a few plant cells. They do have cell walls. We know that from our early conversation on fiber. And they are autotrophic. We learned about that they are producers, right? They can make their own food. They make their own glucose in photosynthesis. We compare that to animals. Animals are also multicellular organisms, right? We're multicelled. And we do not have cell walls. Animals do not have cell walls, which is why if you poke one of us, we squish a little bit, right? We're not as rigidly structured because we don't have that cell wall. And we are heterotrophic. Animals are heterotrophic, which means we need to eat other organisms in order to get our food. Fungi. So you probably knew a lot about plants, even more about animals. Fungi are a little bit different and somewhat distinctive because you can find examples of fungi that are single-celled, like the yeast that are pictured here, or multicellular, like your mushrooms you might put on your pizza. Fungi also have cell walls. Again, it is chemically different than our cellulose-based cell walls we see in plants, but they serve a similar function in giving that kind of rigidity. And fungi are also, like us, like animals, they're heterotrophic. So they have to consume food from other sources. So maybe living food, but they're also big decomposers. So a lot of our decomposers are in the fungi kingdom, breaking down dead material. And then last but not least are our protists. Our protists are interesting. They can be found as either single-celled or multicelled, like fungi. Mostly they're found as single-celled, like a paramecium. And I'm sorry, I'm not sure if this video is going to work here. It doesn't seem to be working on this recording. But little parameciums, they have organelles. They look like bacteria, but they have organelles and they're larger in size. Those are single-celled examples, but they can form multicellular structures. Like some of our algae and things that grow in oceans or in water. There is no cell wall with our protists. They are heterotrophic or autotrophic. So some members are heterotrophic, some members are autotrophic, a little bit like our bacteria. We actually have to thank protists for their ability to do photosynthesis and to be autotrophic because they are the ones that produce a lot of our oxygen and capture a lot of our carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Okay, so all living things either are cells, like our bacteria, like our protists, like our archaea, where they are a single cell, or are made up of cells, like our animals and our plants, and most of our fungi. And later on, I cannot, in this video, I wasn't sure if I could illustrate this point of defending the statement that cells are dynamic units of life. We're going to get to that, hopefully at some point I can get that into, so that you can be able to explain that concept. But after this video, you should be able to differentiate between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells and classify living things into the kingdoms of life based on the description of their cells.